Like, I like to be in the loop. I like to read popular books to feel like I'm part of something. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going over my November reading wrap-up. I read 13 books in November and I didn't have any 5-star reads, but I did have some 4 stars. So I am going to leave all of the timestamps down below if you're just looking to hear about certain books, but let's go ahead and get into what I read in November. So the first book that I read is something that I literally had on my TBR for an entire year. This was downloaded to my Kindle and for whatever reason, I just didn't feel inclined to pick it up. But finally I did. This is Our Missing Hearts by Celeste, and she's the same author of Little Fires Everywhere, which I really enjoyed, and then Everything You Never Told Me, which I didn't enjoy as much. But this was her first venture into dystopian. Her other books were like realistic fiction, and I think that's part of the reason why I was kind of hesitant to read it, is because I'm not much of a dystopian reader, but I know that she writes really beautifully, even if I don't necessarily connect to her story like I didn't with Everything I Never Told You. I know that her writing is really solid, so I did want to read this, and it wasn't my favorite, to be honest. I only gave it a 2 out of 5. But again, the writing was so solid that I did want to finish it, so keep that in mind. If you just like the craft of writing, you're gonna like her books regardless. Story follows Noah. He's also known in the story as Bird, which is a nickname that his mom gave him, or he says he gave himself, but his mom like continuously called him by that. And he's a biracial 12-year-old boy, so he's half white, half Chinese. And he's right now only living with his dad because his mom was like exiled or ran away. There's like a big mystery around his mom. His mom is Chinese, his dad is white. And basically in this community, society has completely turned against Chinese people. And they're blaming Chinese people for like the economy and why things have gone poorly. And if you're Chinese, people are just being like bigots to them, and basically you don't want to be associated with Chinese people. It's just horrible. So like I said, Bird's mom did mysteriously disappear some years ago. Bird's always had a kind of resentment towards it, but more of like, why did this happen? More of like wonderment than resentment, I would say. And his mom was a poet, and he finds out later like kind of an outlaw, and Bird makes it his mission to learn more about just what's going on in the world and then why his mom had to disappear. This book just fell a little bit flat for me. I didn't really emotionally connect to anyone besides Bird. There were other characters, and the second half has other characters as well that I just wasn't really like deeply moved by. This book doesn't use quotation marks, which normally I hate it when authors choose to do that, but I think that this was like intentionally done and really powerful because obviously they're trying to silence Chinese people. So by not using quotation marks, I think that that was like symbolism for that. Something about this was kind of lackluster, and I didn't really believe like Bird's mom's story once you get to know it. Like something about it didn't really ring true or add up, but at the same time, like I could kind of see that being the point. Like it doesn't take much to piss off the government. I don't know, it was an odd read, and it just felt too long to me, and I just didn't necessarily like it despite how well written it was. The second book that I read was probably one of the worst books I've read in a while. This was Damned by Chuck Palahniuk, and he is the same author of Fight Club. I read Fight Club probably about 7 years ago, and Chuck Palahniuk will even admit this himself. The movie is so much better, which I never say. And I ended up giving Damned 1 out of 5 stars. It was just an odd read, to be quite frank. I think I just skimmed like the last 50 pages because I was ready to be done with this book. But I had already invested so much time, I was like, I can't just DNF it with 10% left. Anyone else feel that way? So this follows Madison. Madison is a 13-year-old girl who has died and gone to hell. It starts off kind of strong. Madison kind of starts off on like this breakfast club type of journey where the people she meets just fit into those tropes, and then they start exploring hell, and then it just takes like a really weird twist, and he kind of like abandons the breakfast club idea, and then it just becomes like this existential, like, what is hell? What is the devil? Do I believe in religion type of thing? And I didn't like the main character Madison at all. She's like this really snarky 13-year-old. She's the daughter of a movie star and a business owner, and so her parents are like really famous, and that's supposed to be part of the joke, is that they're like very self-absorbed a-holes and they adopt kids just for like PR, and then they ship these kids off to boarding school, but Madison's their only biological child. And I just found this to be like very eye-rolly. A lot of the references that Madison as a 13-year-old made like no sense for when this book was published. Like they were like 80s and 90s references, but Madison would have been born in like the 2000s, so I didn't get all of the references. I did get a lot of them, but I was just like, this is such an odd book, so definitely do not recommend. The next book that I read is a thriller. This is called The Wife Stalker by Constantine. They are the same author as The Last Mrs. Parrish, which I did enjoy, but I just didn't like this one. I gave a 1.5 out of 5. And when I don't like books, I like to go to Goodreads and read other low reviews, because I'm like, did someone else feel that way? Like, am I seen? Am I heard? So let me talk about the premise, and then we'll talk about why it didn't work. So basically this follows an earthy woman in town. She's new to town. Her name is Piper. She's very like holistic and just kind of like out there. She's a granola lady. Piper falls in insta-love, which, I hate insta-love storylines, with a lawyer named Leo. Leo has 2 kids, and then there's another character named Joanna. She's devastated because Leo was supposed to be hers, and he was like kind of with her, and she's really close with the kids. And there's a twist at the end that I was like, oh, okay, interesting. But like this just fell so flat, and like I was saying at the beginning of this, whenever I was reading those Goodreads reviews, someone said Leo was so like unimportant and so dry in this book that he could have been, I think it was like a mop, and you wouldn't have known the difference. And that's exactly how I felt. Like the characters were just so one-dimensional, like nothing about them was important. The writing, it was just bad. Honestly, like I really like The Last Mrs. Parrish, but every other book I've read by Constantine, I guess I would equate the writing style to like Colleen Hoover if she did thrillers, which is not my personal cup of tea, but other people may enjoy that, so just not good. Okay, the next book that I read, like, it was such a shock to me. This is The Happy Place by Emily Henry. I've read all of Emily Henry's books thus far, except for People We Meet on Vacation. I did read Book Lovers and Beach Read, and I didn't like Book Lovers at all. I thought Beach Read was like super mid, super okay. So I know everyone else and their mother likes Emily Henry, but I just was like, the writing's good, like don't get me wrong, but like I just don't think it's like anything to stop and think about. So when I read Happy Place, I was kind of like, okay, like I like to be in the loop. I like to read popular books to feel like I'm part of something, but I didn't really expect all that much from it, and I was proven so wrong. I really did enjoy this book. I ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which for me is like a really good rating. I know that may not sound that great, but for me, I'm a tough critic, and that's a really good rating. So the story follows Harriet and Wynn. Harriet and Wynn are going on vacations with their best friends from college, and Harriet and Wynn are a couple who have broken up, but they don't want to tell their friends that they've broken up because the place where they're going on vacation with their friends, it's what Harriet thinks of as her happy place. It's their rich friends like beach house, and the beach house is being sold, and so they don't want to ruin this vacation by, you know, being kind of like a downer and letting everyone know that they broke off their engagement. But Harriet and Wynn are forced to pretend that they're a couple on vacation and kind of like confront why they're no longer together. And it is a miscommunication trope of sorts, which I don't typically like, but it was so well done and I think so realistic that it didn't bother me. Wynn is one of my favorite male characters. I think he is so relatable, and like his vulnerability and his insecurities I thought were just so well done, and they made so much sense in comparison to like how Harriet was and why he would have these vulnerabilities. And then the ending, I know a lot of people had problems with, but I think it made perfect sense for Harriet and kind of what you know about her background and like her lifestyle and why she made some of the decisions that she made. So I can see how people could have a negative take on it. It's kind of hard to say anything without giving it away, but a lot of the times when that ending is shown, you think that it's done for the wrong reasons, but I think Harriet chose the path that she chose for the right reasons. Really, my biggest flaw with this book is that it was kind of slower paced in the beginning, and I really didn't care about the friend subplot, especially Sabrina. I could not stand Sabrina. She was just like a spoiled brat, and she had no boundaries, and she kind of like ruined my reading experience. But if it was just Harriet and Wynne and like a little bit less of the friends, I think that this could have been like a really solid contender for a 5-star read. But overall, a really good read. The 5th book that I read was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. This was my first Ann Patchett book, but I have a bunch on my TBR. I ended up giving this one a 3.25 out of 5. The writing is really strong and it's there. It was just kind of draggy at some parts. So this actually takes place during the pandemic, which I normally hate it when the pandemic is mentioned in books, but this one really didn't like take me out of the story, and it made a lot of sense as to why it took place in the pandemic. So this follows your main character, Laura. Laura is telling her 3 daughters who are like all in their 20s, and I think one's in like her late teens, basically about her life, and in particular one summer where Laura was an actress at Tom Lake. Laura played the main character Emily in Our Town. She ends up in a relationship with a man named Peter Duke. Peter Duke goes on to become like a famous movie star. So her daughters have always had this like what happened there type of like mystique around it. Like, why would you choose this like boring mundane life on a farm when you could have been a famous actress and you were dating like basically Peter Duke is like Tom Cruise. Like, you were dating Tom Cruise of your generation, although he wasn't like Tom Cruise yet. Like Tom Cruise before Tom Cruise was Tom Cruise. Like, why didn't you follow this path? Why are you on this like farm mom path instead of this like luxurious famous lifestyle? And so I think there were a lot of really great lessons in there, but like I said, it was just kind of slow in part. I thought it was really relatable how her daughters like romanticized this part of her life because they didn't have the full picture. But I just didn't think any of the characters were like the type to like jump off the page and that you would remember. Like, I'm already starting to forget her daughters' names, and I just thought it was okay. It's probably not a book I'm going to think about again, but it definitely wasn't a bad book. The 6th book that I read was a memoir, and it's probably like one of the most anticipated memoirs of the year, and that was The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. And I didn't give this a rating because it just doesn't feel right sometimes to rate memoirs, and this one was so vulnerable and raw. So I am a Britney fan. I'm not like a mega fan, but I very distinctly remember being like 5 or 6 years old watching the Oops, I Did It Again music video and being like transfixed and like wide-eyed in front of the TV. I made the mistake of going into this book having read a lot of like spoilers on Reddit, so I kind of knew a lot of all of like the big things that did happen in this book, therefore I kind of like ruined it for myself. But I still would recommend reading it. It's not the best written book ever. You're not going to get like a Jeanette McCurdy like, oh damn, she's an actress but she can write type of sentence structure. And there where it's like really lyrical, you're just gonna get like, here's what happened. And it is really raw, even though it's like very simplistic writing. It's only like 200 and something pages, so I ended up reading this just like in a night. And I just feel horrible for Britney and everything that she's been through, and that these people took advantage of her. They're supposed to be her family, and they just exploited her for fame, and they took advantage of her vulnerable mental health at times, and they used her kids against her. They used it as like, okay, if you don't do this, then you're never going to see your boys again, which is just disgusting because all Britney cares about is the well-being of her boys. And I just have a lot of feelings about it. But definitely a worthwhile read, even if you're not a fan of Britney. Famous people, it's not all glam and glitz. There's a lot of exploitation that comes with it, especially if you're younger when you go into the industry and you don't really know what you're doing because you're naive to it all. Then unfortunately people do take advantage of you. The 7th book that I read is a non-fiction book. This is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This I ended up giving a 3 out of 5 stars. If you like 2020 or Dateline, you'll probably end up liking this book. In Cold Blood details the brutal murders of the Clutter family, and it took place in 1959. It also follows the two murderers who committed the crime. You find out really quickly who those two idiots are, and then how the police eventually connected all the dots and solved the case. It was definitely interesting, and it was really profound for its time because not a lot of like true crime books like this had been published before. I think I read that after Helter Skelter, which is about Charles Manson, this is the second most sold true crime novel ever. So definitely very interesting. Like I said, very innovative for its time. But I think now with how much we have on like documentaries and 2020 and Dateline and things like that, it just wasn't necessarily all that interesting at times, especially because sometimes Truman and Capote would like tangent about other like side people who weren't like really relevant to the story or like kind of mundane details. Like he definitely did his research, definitely a great journalist, definitely like covered all his tracks. I know a lot of the criticisms that he got from In Cold Blood is that he kind of made you sympathetic to one of the killers more than the other. But if anything, I think that's important because it's like humanizing them. It's like not justifying what they did by any means, but definitely humanizing them and making it so that it's not just like pure evil. Because if you're into true crime, I would definitely say it's worth a read. The 8th book that I read in November was Us Against You. This was the 2nd book in the Beartown trilogy, and I loved Beartown. It was like a surprise for me because I didn't really necessarily love Frederik Bachman's other books, so I was really excited to read the 2nd book in the trilogy, and I ended up kind of disappointed, and I gave this a 3.25 out of 5, so not a bad rating by any means, but it just didn't have the same magic as Beartown. I'm definitely going to read the last book in the trilogy called The Winners here soon, but I'm hoping that The Winners is more like the original Beartown and not Us Against You. So this follows the aftermath of the events that happened in the first Beartown and just how the town is now handling that head hockey is taking over most of the players. So the kind of essential question is, can Beartown rebuild its hockey team despite all of the players going to head? And it just kind of lost some of the charm, just focused too much on politics and the pact for me. I just kind of missed some of the characters from the first novels that I grew like really close to. Like I felt like Maya was barely even in this one, and she was one of the main characters that you connected with in the first Beartown. I always want more Benji in Beartown. He is my favorite character by far. And then I'm also really curious to see how the 3rd book plays out because the 2nd book kind of wrapped everything up, and I was really confused about that, but coincidentally, Ellen Hildebrand on her podcast, Books, Beach, and Beyond, that she co-hosts with Tim Ehrenberg or Tim Talks Books, they actually had Frederik Bachman on like right after I finished this book. So I listened to the interview with Frederik Bachman, and he said the reason why he like wraps up Beartown like every single book, he doesn't leave it on a cliffhanger, instead he kind of lets you know like what happens to some of the characters, is because he wants them to read as standalones just in case someone just happens to pick up Us Against You before they pick up Beartown. And so I thought that was interesting, but I don't really love that. I guess it makes sense, but like as someone who likes the cliffhanger and I guess the gimmicky part to like keep me reading, I wish he didn't do that. I wish it was like more ambiguous at the end. The 9th book that I read this year is one of my favorites. I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 5, and I've seen everyone recommend this on Reddit. I quite honestly use Reddit for book recommendations more than like YouTube or Goodreads or even like Friends, because the people of Reddit normally know what they're talking about. So this book is called Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is kind of an older book. I think it was published in like 2002, but it's one that I don't think I really hear anyone like my age talking about. So I'm really glad that I saw so many people recommending this, and it's so impactful. So if you haven't read this, I'm recommending it to you right now. So this is a powerful story about a mentally handicapped man. He's got an IQ of about 60, and he knows that he's not very smart, but he's willing to try really hard. So because of his effort, his teacher at the special education school he goes to, she recommends him for a program, an experimental program, and basically what they're doing is they're going to raise his IQ. They're going to go in, give him like brain surgery of sorts, and raise his IQ so that he has an exceptional mental capacity. So he goes from having a really low IQ to having a super above average IQ of like 180. So basically doubling his IQ, but the IQ that he has is going to be slowly raised. So after the surgery, it's not going to be like instant genius. Instead, it's going to slowly start to get better. It's structured really interesting because it's written from the main character's like journal entries. In the beginning, you see how things are misspelled and his grammar isn't the best, to eventually he's like saying the journal entries like, I'm dumbing these down because anyone reading this isn't going to be able to understand how like my brain works. So the smarter he got, the less understood he felt. So when he had a low IQ, he felt misunderstood, but he was able to kind of like laugh and feel like he belonged and like he wasn't as aware of his surroundings. Whereas the more intelligent he got, like the less he was able to relate to people, but he was now like ultra aware, and he kind of almost became like an elitist of sorts because he's like, well, they don't know this and I know this, and like his relationships and how they change, and he started making people feel bad about themselves because he was so smart, and he went from being like the joke of things to now everyone like doesn't want to be around him because he intimidates them. So it was kind of like a double-edged sword. Like he couldn't find happiness either way. And then you have Algernon, which is the lab rat that they did the initial experiment on, and then like how their lives are paralleling and how they're going around and parading Charlie, our main character, and Algernon around and like taking all the credit for their intellect. And it's a really interesting read. The only reason why I didn't end up giving this 5 stars is because it did drag a little bit in places, like especially in like Charlie's sex life. Like I didn't super care about his sex life. I thought, yeah, that makes sense that you want to incorporate like how he's struggling there because he's never had any sort of encounters like that whenever he did have the lower IQ. But it just felt like too dragged out in places. Like it was just too big of a storyline in my personal preference. And I actually read that this was initially kind of more of like a novella, and that Daniel Keyes went back and expanded this into a novel length. So I think I might have given the novella 5 out of 5 stars, just depending on the content there. But overall, a really impactful read. I was telling my husband about it. He doesn't really read much, but I was like, you have to read this book. So it's that type of book where you think about it and then you recommend it to others and you just want to talk about it. The 10th book that I read was called The Lake House. This is by Kate Morton, and this is my first Kate Morton novel, and I heard so many great things about her writing, but unfortunately I just didn't really like this book. I ended up giving this a 2 out of 5. This is a mystery that spans across decades, and it does have the parallel timelines. This follows the Edvane family, and it's the night of their big party in June of 1933 at their lake house, and their baby boy, who's like a year old, Theo, goes missing that night, and his disappearance is just never solved. And then our present day storyline takes place 70 years later, and it's going to follow a detective named Sadie Sparrow. Basically, Sadie stumbles across the lake house, and then she finds out about the disappearance of Theo, and she makes it her mission to solve the disappearance. So Sadie seeks out Theo's sister, Alice. Alice is, you know, an older woman now. She's written a lot of like Agatha Christie style books, and she's famous for that. And Sadie seeks Alice out because she wants to, you know, get her insights as to what happened, and she thinks, of course, like, hey, she's writing like all of these mystery books and her brother mysteriously disappeared all these years ago. Does she know more than she's saying? But whenever she tries to approach Alice, Alice is like really flighty, pretends like she doesn't know what she's talking about, etc. And Sadie just refused to believe that the Edvane family knows nothing about it. And then there's all of these like red herrings throughout, and this book just was way too long. It was like, I want to say either 500 pages or like almost 500 pages, and honestly it could have been very easily like a 300-page book. And then there was like not just those 2 storylines, there was also like another subplot storyline, and we had to learn like the background on like every single character, I felt like, and I just didn't really care. It got very tedious. I didn't like Sadie or Alice at all. And then the final conclusion of this book was so bad. Like, it was so circular, it was so Hallmark cringy, and I saw it coming is the worst part. I literally saw it coming because I thought to myself when one character was introduced, I said, I bet blank blank blank. And I was like, no, there's no way that Kate Morton would do that, because that is just so stupid. And she did that. And horrible. If you like Hallmark movies, you might like this, but I just felt like it was a big waste of my time. The writing was good though. The 11th book that I read in November was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and honestly I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about this because I listened to The Goldfinch on audiobook last year, and the first 20% of The Goldfinch I loved. I devoured. I was like, this is gonna be one of the best books I've ever read in my life. And then it just went downhill from there. But Donna Tartt's writing's beautiful. Like, it's almost too beautiful. So I wasn't really sure how I was gonna feel about The Secret History, because having known that about Donna Tartt, that she's kind of an overwriter, and that sometimes she takes her stories in directions, I'm like, no, I don't want to go in that way. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it. And then also with there being a lot of opinions about The Secret History that I've seen online, it was a toss-up. But I wanted to try this out. This is dark academia, so I don't really know what that means, but sure, let's go with it. I ended up loving this book. It was a surprise to everyone, and I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5. I've seen a lot of people criticize If We Were Villains for paralleling Secret History too closely, but having read both books in a short span near each other, I would say they're definitely different. Personally, I like The Secret History a lot more than I liked If We Were Villains, but I've heard the opposite as well. So if you're into dark academia, I would say try them both. Secret History follows a group of students at a college. They're all part of this elite linguist program. In particular, they're studying the Greek language. You have to be invited to be in it. There's only a handful of them, and it's just, if you like secret society type of things, if you're the type of person that's drawn to things because you know that there's just a small amount of people that are going to get in, that's kind of this group. So it follows them. At the very beginning of the story, you find out in the prologue that one of the characters named Bunny is murdered by the group. So it's basically the events leading up to Bunny's murder and then the aftermath of Bunny's murder. So it's really interesting going in knowing that Bunny's gonna die. The stakes are high for him, and just trying to piece together how is this going to happen. I think where a lot of people probably don't like this book is that it can be kind of mundane in the beginning, because Bunny ends up dying at the 50% mark, about at the 50% mark. So it's a lot of build up, it's a lot of character development, it's a lot of background knowledge. So if you're not really into that, that could be why you don't like The Secret History. But I thought it was just compelling. The story is told in a first-person point of view by our main character, Richard. Richard is new to the school. He's invited to be a part of the language program at the last minute, kind of after he proves himself. And Richard comes from very humble beginnings. He's not very well off, whereas the other kids in this program, they are really well off, or at least they act like they are. So Richard kind of has to lie to fit in, and he's just an interesting character. He's very similar to the character telling the story If We Were Villains, Oliver. So I see the parallels between that there, but the rest of the story I think is pretty different. And then I think why this story really shined to me is that all of the characters were so elitist and unlikable, while also managing to be compelling and likable. And I just think that's what, to me, resonated. These are really well thought out characters. These are people I'm I know people like this, because no one's super all good. No one's all bad. They read as very real, pretentious characters. So I don't know, I feel like I've met less extreme versions of these characters before. Definitely less extreme, because some of the stuff they do is just odd. I will say though, if I'm gonna be super nitpicky, Donna Tartt used the word brusque so many times. It was driving me insane. That's like a super nitpicky like snark on the book. And then my other big criticism of the book is after Bunny's murder, they say a lot of things about the teacher Julian and like how impactful and what a great mentor and leader he's been to them. But I feel like up until that point, Julian's like barely mentioned, so it just kind of seemed to come out of like nowhere. Like them putting him on the pedestal and saying that he's doing so much for them. So those are like my two big criticisms that stopped this from being a 5-star, but I really did enjoy this book. The 12th book that I read was the second book in a series. This is called The Night in Question, and it was the second book in the Agathas series. This is a young adult mystery series. This is co-written by Kathleen Glasgow and Liz Lawson. And I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5. I like the original Agathas book much more than this one. But the story follows two girls. There's our main character, Alice. Alice is like your spoiled rich girl. She's obsessed with Agatha Christie novels. And there's a lot of character development that Alice shows in the first book. And this one, I just felt like she didn't really mature as much as I would have liked. And then her co-detective Iris. Iris goes to the same school as Alice. She's seen as more of like the loser track. She's very intelligent. She's not well off financially, but she's got a really great heart and she's just like a really sweet girl. They are back together in their mystery solving duo, and what happens is they're all at a dance, everyone at their school, and Alice goes to explore the castle because she's always been really intrigued with the castle because decades ago an upcoming movie star, think like Evelyn Hugo, Marilyn Monroe type of thing. Yes, I realize one of those characters I just said is fictional, one of them is real, but this upcoming movie star named Mona Moody used to live at this castle, and there's a lot of like mystique around how Mona Moody died at the castle. So Alice goes to explore that while everyone else is having a good old time at the dance. And while Alice is going to just explore and see all of Mona Moody's stuff at the castle where she's not supposed to be, you know, walking around, she stumbles upon Rebecca Kennedy. Rebecca Kennedy is Alice's former friend from the popular group, and she sees that Rebecca has been stabbed and is like bleeding out on the floor, and then standing over Rebecca is another one of her former friends, Helen Park, and Helen's holding a weapon of sorts. It's like I think it was an envelope cutter, and Helen's like, no, I swear, like I didn't do this. And for whatever reason, Alice believes her, so Alice and Iris get together to try and solve what ended up happening to Rebecca, who's now in a coma. And then while they're solving that, they end up solving what also happened all of those years ago to the movie Scarlet, Mona Moody, and it was okay. Just, I really liked the first one just significantly more. I think that this one was lacking a lot of the relationships I liked in the first book. I just didn't have as much of a charm to it, I would say, but it definitely wasn't a bad book. If they come out with a third one, I'll read it for sure. I just think that where they really shone in the first book was the friendship between Iris and Alice. Also, I figured out about 20% into the book who the attacker was, so that did kind of like ruin it for me. The 13th and last book that I ended up reading in November was called Suicide Notes from Beautiful Girls. This is a young adult novel, and it's a mystery. It's think like 13 Reasons Why, but unhinged. So I ended up giving this a 1.75 out of 5. I just didn't think it was very good. The premise of this is that June, who is a like stereotypical like rule follower, good girl, her best friend Delia, who was like a very captivating, like kind of like wild child type of girl, has allegedly killed herself by lighting herself on fire in her stepdad's shed while her parents were on vacation. June and Delia had a falling out about a year prior to Delia setting herself on fire, and June's always felt wrong about that, but she doesn't know how to write it, or if she does want to write everything between them. But despite them having this falling out and not really keeping in contact with Delia anymore, June, when she hears that Delia killed herself in this way, she just is kind of struck with the premonition that this doesn't sound like something Delia would do. So June sets out to solve the mystery. Is this staged? Like, what happened here? Because it's just very hard to believe that Delia killed herself. I will say the twist did take me by surprise, but then after that twist, it just went downhill from there. I just didn't think that any of the characters were really well thought out or likable. June had essentially no personality outside of having a boyfriend and being friends with Delia. And the author also utilized something that I really don't like to see in young adult books, which is the author gave June a really like neglectful mom to kind of like excuse how June was able to just do so much and be away from her house despite being a teenager, which I think is something that a lot of authors kind of like rely on so that they don't have to build in like parents freaking out about me storyline. Delia was really the only interesting character, but there were just a lot of questions left unanswered. By the end of the book, there's some side characters that you're introduced to that they're not like thoroughly fleshed out or explained. And then the ending was like crazy ambiguous, which I personally don't like unless there's like a sequel to tie it all up. So I just felt like it was trying too hard to be edgy and cool and not like other books. Those were all of the books that I did read in November. Let me know down below what were some of the best reads that you had in November. What are you reading in December? And if you did enjoy this, you make sure that you give it a thumbs up and you hit the subscribe button. I will see you guys next video. Bye!